Welcome back to the Brando and Joe podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Marino Mugayar-Baldocchi. He received his PhD in IO psychology from Baruch College and currently works at McKinsey and Company as a research science expert. Welcome, Marino. Thanks for joining us today.
Welcome.
Thank you so much, Joe and Brandon. Really appreciate it. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we know you're super busy. I think we last heard you speak at the Career Day fair at Metro, because I think that's when we first saw your profile, I was like, oh, Brandon, we have to have him on.
Thank you. It was really nice to speak there. I think having a broad range of perspectives and seeing people at different career tenures, different types of places, either consulting, industry, or even academia. It's just nice to see how many people make the same thing work in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. That was the first career day that we were at. And especially for students, it kind of just opens their eyes to all the different things that you can do. When was it? Was it in the spring or was it in the fall?
Yeah, it was spring.
Okay, because I think that's what I remembered. Where it was we went through a semester and a half already at Hofstra, and we kind of learned a little bit about IO in general for something that we have no idea what it was a year ago. So then hearing, especially you speak about McKinsey Co, a prestigious firm, and hearing about what an IO can do in this field. It was really cool to hear.
No, my pleasure. And I think we're all in the same boat when we started the IO program. Most people don't know what it's about. Some kind of nebulous concept of, consulting, but what do you consult on? Well, I give you advice, but what do you give advice on? On things that you need advice on, Those kinds of conversations where you to define what you're going to do and figure out whether you want to do a master or PhD in an area that could lead you toward that kind of path. I think it's a leap of faith that we take, but trusting that this very growing and very noble field of ours is going to take us in a direction that actually resonates with our life's purpose.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point there too about just consulting and the ambiguity around it. I think consulting in general is a relatively ambiguous field, but then you throw IO into consulting, and I think that it almost makes it even more ambiguous than what people would probably expect.
Right, because at least in my experience so far, we have a lot of contrast between experience and expertise. And I think consulting mixes both expertise and experience in a way that the separation isn't super clearly delineated. Where does the expertise come in the face of experience? And it's always a joint approach where sometimes you lead with experience, sometimes you lead with expertise, but both have to be present. And since consulting truly is helping people think through problems and solve problems and come up with a sustainable plan of implementation, I think the way that IO helps, we are one of the most practical of the psychology fields, but how do we still go from this idea where many of our things have been tested in theory and that have been tested with students and in an environment where it's not the same complex organism? How can we show that expertise translates as well to consulting in the same way that consultants acquire experience? So I think navigating that kind of little tug of war between who we are as academics and who we need to be as practitioners, even though we are much closer toward the practitioner side in this field than most other psychology fields, we're still far away from what some of the true practitioners who don't have a background in IO, how they do this as well.
Yeah, the scientist practitioner gap is always big, but I think for that specific area, like in consulting, I think you can get away with being way further on the practical side, or where you're working and you're applying it, and you can kind of weave the gaps a little bit. I think that you kind of see the theory get thrown in more on those, and maybe you can tell me this, probably in those more internal roles where you can really actually take a look at theory and research it. But talking about research, we want to kind of pivot and speak to your experience at McKinsey. We know you do research science for McKinsey. What does that necessarily mean? Because obviously you're at a consulting firm. What does research science at a consulting firm mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I can answer that with a little bit of a story of how things started so we can make the research come to life. Data tells a story, but a story can tell the data as well. So we can... I started at the firm on Valentine's Day 20. So it was the beginning of a beautiful new relationship at a time where the world wasn't quite aware of what was to come. And I started as an intern, so as a part-time worker while I was finishing up my PhD at Baruch. My PhD was in stress and well-being within a specific area called illegitimate tasks. So I wanted to figure out the kinds of tasks that people had at work, how they either reaffirmed their professional identity or they violated it by asking them to do something that was either unreasonable or unnecessary. And I had one of those when I was in college. I got this apparently super prestigious internship at the National Crime Victim Center at the Institute of Psychiatry in South Carolina. And it was a very prestigious scholarship. I was rejected from it the first time because I didn't have behavioral neuroscience. And the second time when I applied for it, I was like, okay, I'm the best student in the class. I'm going to be able to get it here. I finally got it. In my first week and a half, I was doing trainings to obviously be able to perform at my role. I'm doing a lot of training videos to understand their history, what they did, the types of patients that they saw, how the clinic operated, and how it was evolving as well from the clinical director's perspective. And then my supervisor kept telling me over time, I have a really special task for you at the end of your training. I have a really special task for you. I'm like, oh, I'm going to be shadowing. I'm going to be writing grants. I'm going to be proofreading papers. I'm going to be helping them come up with their vision statement for something. I'm going to be applying all the skills that I was learning. I had to paste 500 lollipops and 500 brochures. And when I asked the supervisor, what is the special task? She was like, oh, this is the special task. And to say that I felt like my professional identity, which was in its nascency, was completely violated was an understatement. I felt disrespected, humiliated. I was like, I got rejected from this internship last year because I didn't have behavior neuroscience, but I could have pasted lollipops last year, the year before, 5 years ago. Maybe I could have done this when I was a child. I would have been fantastic at it. I was very adventurous as a child. Instead of building a castle, I could have built lollipops and brochures. And all that is to say that personal experiences deeply fueled my desire to study illegitimate tasks in grad school. And my advisor, Erin Ito, when I found out that that's what she studied, was like, I have a perfect variable to add to this. How about trust between the supervisor and the employee? Maybe that's a moderator of the relationship between illegitimate tasks and whatever the outcomes it is that we want to look at. So I was finishing that, and I had already collected all the data for my dissertation and analyzed it. And as an international student, I had to be positioning myself at a point where I was close enough to finishing my PhD where I needed to just do the final write-ups and those things, where I could devote enough time to that, but also enough brain space to start something completely different. And your consulting brain and your academic brain are two very different things. So switching between the two, I wanted to make sure that I was ready, that it didn't take too much task switching for me to be able to spend the next year in my fellowship finishing up my dissertation, but also being successful enough to hopefully be considered for a full-time job. Those dreams were short-lived because 3 weeks later the pandemic hit and it kind of uprooted the way that we were doing things. So the research that we had been doing so far had been on a humanistic lens to the future of work, and thinking about the idea of adaptability as a meta skill that was going to help you be prepared for the future of work in about 5 to 10 years, the meta skill of the future. Well, when the pandemic hit, it was the meta skill of now. How do we teach adaptability to people now as opposed to something that was going to be a slow battle of upskilling, reskilling, and redeployment over the next 5 to 10 years to prepare the workforce? So my first taste of research there was one of my favorite senior partners called my boss, that you know very well, Randy Lim, and he asked him, I need the help from the fellows to research this idea of leadership in crisis. There are 5 topics that I would like to research, and I wanted to find case studies on different global pandemics or crises where we see these 5 themes play out. I was assigned the West African Ebola crisis, and I had no background in public health or in geopolitics of any way to know anything beyond what I saw in the news. But in the space of about 6 hours, I had to come up with, what is the case study plan? How do we find these 5 elements around network of teams, empathetic leadership, communication, deliberate calm and bounded optimism? So how do we find these kinds of elements in the actions that governments, public health organizations, local groups, and other types of parties that were intervening and that were partaking in those. How do we find these themes playing out? Long story short, or as my friends say that I do, short story long, I did this. I got some interaction with the senior partner. I sent it out. He was like, to the other person on my team, he said, excellent work, amazing. To me, he was like, I have 3 questions. I was like, okay, maybe I should try harder. Question 1, the answer is this. Question 3, the answer is that. Question 2, give me 10 minutes. 5 minutes later, it's like, I have another question. I answered that question, then I asked the question 2 that I was missing. 20 minutes go by, he says nothing, then he's like, can I call? I was like, oh dear God, somebody please make this man stop. I feel like I'm giving him everything that I know and I'm learning on the go, but I feel like he still has so many questions that in academia, the lag time between your interaction with your mentor, with the lab person, lab director, or even with the program director, they're so much more sporadic because you have time to come up with a very robust answer that then you're going to analyze the very minor detail. And this was the first shift in my thinking. This man who is brilliant wants to interact very quickly to come up with answers that, am I confident enough in the robustness of this answer to share with him? And I did literature reviews faster than I've ever done it, but I still felt like maybe this isn't enough for him. Maybe I should be doing more. And I was always adding more information as he was asking for it. So once we did that, he called me, we talked, and he was like, I want to write an article with you. I'm going to bring a partner and an associate partner. He's a senior partner. And I want you to be the research center of this, or we're going to give you questions. You do exactly what you did for me here, but we're going to show you how we do articles in a McKinsey way. We're going to show you how we think about this, because it's not just about the rigidity of the research. We need it to be solid and robust so that it doesn't break when people examine it, but we also need it to be something much more than just a beautifully theoretical piece of information. We need it to be something very practical so that people engaging with this can actually know what to do, because we have to help people with this information. So learning how to go from very theoretical basic research to very practical applied research, that was the first big change for me, especially with the speed. We went from doing the literature review to publishing the article in 2 weeks. You think how long it takes to publish an article in academia, right?
That's crazy.
Before I even get into my question, I couldn't imagine doing both those things at the same time, like dissertation and then like starting at McKinsey. I see some of our PhD students in our cohort or our program, and I was like, how do you guys even work a part-time job or something? So all props to you.
Thank you. But it's usually something, maybe more props to them because they are at an earlier stage of their program. For me, it was more, I had to plan it in such a way because I know I am a very one-track mind kind of person. I am here or I am there. I cannot multitask in a way where I'm like, oh, now I'm going to be academic. Now I'm going to be consultancy. I am either one or the other. And I'm trying to create a blend. Over the last 2.5 years, it has helped to be here so you can create a true scientist practitioner approach. But let me tell you, the first time I looked at my dissertation, after I defended it, I was like, I don't remember writing this. I don't know what's going on here. I remember somebody that was like me wrote this, but it seems like the way I think about this has changed. So,
no, you bring up a good point, because it's hard enough to multitask as it is, but when both tasks are as complex as you're talking about, it makes it even tougher. I wanted to kind of backtrack just a little bit to your illegitimate task research point, because it made me think, and if I'm totally wrong, you could just tell me, because I don't know all the research behind it. But when we were at PsyOp, we went to Directly Correct. They're talking about AI in the workplace, and they're talking about how AI has been or can take our jobs, and then they're saying maybe it's just those like data entry jobs where you're as you were talking about, like, I don't need this degree to just put in these numbers or put lollipops on this brochure. And then someone brought up the point, well, some people like those jobs. And I wanted to get your perspective on that idea. Well, are there some people who might like these illegitimate tasks even if they don't provide that like significance? Like, are they don't mind going to a 9 to 5, plugging away at their computer, and then disassociating from that in the off hours?
Great question. And I think one of the Norbert Semmer, who was the person who came up with this idea of illegitimate tasks, I once was giving a talk at PsyOp, my symposium, and I said, well, illegitimate tasks are something that, and then I saw him walk into the auditorium. And I was like, okay, everyone, don't panic. But the person who created the construct that I'm about to hopefully do justice to has just walked in here. So there's absolutely no pressure on anyone, especially not me. And he laughed. I was like, no, I'm just here as a supporter of this. And there's somebody who's very glad to see you doing the research that on a construct that is very dear to me. And he explained he's like, just let me say one thing. Illegitimate tasks are not something that are inherently objective. No such task that we think is illegitimate is legitimate for everyone. It might be that the three of us have very good alignment for whatever reason, that this particular task is something that we wouldn't like to do. But perhaps data entry. When I worked in college at the admissions office, data entry was the part that my supervisor would always tell me that I was the worst at, because I just didn't want to do it. I just thought I had other skills that I wanted to do. And there was my very introverted friend and colleague loved data entry because she didn't want to talk to anyone. So we would separate it. We'd have stacks of 100 data entry pieces each. I'd give her all of mine, but in exchange, I would talk to all the people who were coming in. So she didn't have to do that. So for me, doing data entry was an illegitimate task. For her, talking to people felt like an illegitimate task because she felt so much social anxiety that talking to somebody at work, all these strangers all the time, were beyond what she felt comfortable doing. So absolutely right. No such thing as an inherently illegitimate task. It's all in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, we have a performance management class, and one of the things we talk about with measuring performance was the individual differences of people. Mm-hmm. And so I'm sure that that's something you probably saw with the illegitimate tasks. A question that came to my mind when you were talking about the research that you were doing was, you mentioned trust, mm-hmm. right? What did you find with that, like, difference in supervisor trust? And like, what were you, I guess, searching for with that?
Great question. Unfortunately, with my graduate school budget, I found that insufficient power is an issue with underpowered studies where you can't find statistical significance, even though you find things trending towards significance and with a promising coefficient or promising effect size. So we found a directionally supported relationship, but it was just underpowered. But trust does matter, because trust impacts your way of appraising what the task is. So you think about, if there's somebody that you really trust in your program or at work, and they ask you to do something like, hey, would you mind, I don't know, helping me pick up my daughter from school, or pick up coffee, or like come and do that. Most people, when you have a very trusting relationship, especially with a senior person, you will appraise that as, they're giving me this trust. Out of everybody else they could ask to do this, they want me to get closer to them, because that's an opportunity for you to interact with them, to have access to something that is outside of the scope of your role. So you could interpret it as illegitimate, but given the social access that it gives you, it might be interpreted as an opportunity rather than as an illegitimate task. So, but when you have somebody else, and this was always the case, I remember in my high school in Australia, there was always a substitute teacher that didn't have a background in the subject that we were going to learn at. And the substitute teacher was a general teacher. One teacher in particular, he was just good enough to be able to speak about general topics in most subjects, but he wasn't a deep expert in that. And we were in the honors college. And at that point, it was very difficult for us to actually have the same kind of trust in his knowledge as we did for the very deeply specialized, especially English teacher that we had at the time. So when he would speak, the students in the class and he would assign homework, they wouldn't do it, because he didn't trust that he knew that this was the homework that we needed to do. But when our main teacher would give us the same homework, people were thanking God that we had her as a teacher, because she was so brilliant. It was the same piece of homework. There was no difference. It was the same assigned reading, the same text, the same kinds of questions. But when you trust the recipient, you will praise the task differently.
It's an interesting point. I'm glad that we actually got to dive into like your research actually and like learn about it. I didn't think we'd be able to get down this hole.
I feel like there were 10 different nuggets in that story that Joe and I could have pulled a thread on. But for the interest of time, Marino, we wanted to make sure with all of your experience that we are able to ask you what type of advice do you have for incoming IO students who are trying to enter the field?
Absolutely. And I'll answer that. One thing I would like to finish from the previous many unpulled threads that we have, maybe we add one more. The research that we do then becomes a vehicle or a platform for the client discussions that we have. A lot of the ways that we pride ourselves at McKinsey is by having a lot of the forethinking and the intellectual property to show that what we're being consulted on, we have evidence-backed strategies. And I think that's a nice segue to talking about the roles of IO and the advice that I have to give. I think knowing that the role that I have here is not a traditional consultant. They don't look at my role, and there are times where there is a little bit of a lack of role clarity because they're like, okay, are you a consultant? Are you not a consultant? I'm like, I am like a consultant, but I have other skills that are different than what your typical consultants have. And they have certain skills that I don't have that I am learning because I didn't go to business school. I went through a different route of education for what do I value? How do I think about problems? So on and so forth. So it's finding a way to have that synergy where you can work together to understand that at the end of the day, we are all people in a very agile team trying to help clients solve very, very complex nested issues. So the articles and the research that we do is one of the flagpoles, if you want to call it that, where we signal to the clients that there is expertise and experience here to be able to solve this problem. One will not be enough. Both in combination will be the best chance that we have of solving this problem sustainably. Because you don't want to solve the problem, then 6 months later, it reemerges and the client has some kind of relapse because the structures that were put in place were not sustainable or they were not evidence-backed to make sure that this was sustained, enduring change. So I think the advice that I have is, as I was going through my life and my career, I always thought that I wanted to be a professor at a teaching-oriented university. And maybe from the fact that I talk too much, you could see that as like, yeah, maybe I could see that happening. And I had to make certain career choices that I never even knew were possible because I opened my mind to what are the different ways that I can do the same thing. And there was a brilliant PhD student in my program who part of his dissertation was understanding skills generalizability. How are skills useful across different contexts depending on how you're framing? So how does your ability to articulate yourself, which might be very good for public speaking and being in the debate club, also work in terms of storylining? But how does storylining work in terms of data analysis and how you fit an interpretation, not an over-interpretation and a confabulation of the data, but the interpretation of the data into something that's very tangible for people. So when he talked about skills generalization, I always had this interest in building things, mentoring things, creating enduring things. And that can be through the time you spend with students, the information that you share, the lives that you touch, through looking at them as whole people. And I never thought that consulting would be the same thing, just in a very different context. You're creating knowledge assets through the papers that you write. You're creating enduring data assets in terms of the mass research that we do and the data lakes that we possess in terms of seeing, for example, how the employee experience phenomena has evolved over the last 2 and a bit years. And also, holistically, in terms of thinking about the impact. When we think about client impact, it's not just about serving a client and fixing this problem. You have to go deeper and consider that the impact that you're having is you're actually changing people's lives. The amount of time that we spend at work, how much energy and effort it requires every day, it has a deep impact, whether you want to acknowledge it or not, on your personal life. So being able to support people by making their work lives better, you are perhaps directly or even indirectly helping their personal lives. So to think that I would be able to satisfy the same kind of DC and Ryan's needs, my need for competence and autonomy, doing things in academia, but doing very similar things in consulting, but just in a very different context. I think the advice for the students is you will find what you're looking for by looking inward first and then looking outward.
Yeah, there are also so many amazing nuggets to pull from that. And I will say that introspective journey you're talking about, Marino, is, I think, something that students can really pull from that. That and the transferable skills are two of the things that I really want to highlight for students out there, because I think you can use your introspection to look at what transferable skills you do have and then kind of use that and articulate that into whatever career that could look like. And I think you did a really good job at painting a picture of like how that helped you and what you did for that. And I think students can hear from that and find a lot of value. So with that being said, there are so many more things that Joe and I would love to chat with you about. So we might need to do a part 2.
With pleasure.
But it's been so amazing, Marino, to get to hear you speak again and getting to like chat with you individually with Joe and I. It's been great. We want to thank you so much for coming on here with us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you both. It's been a pleasure. If you would love to do a part 2, I would be game for it. But thank you both for doing something that is really helping our field and the people in it feel more connected. I think we're all looking for connection, and you doing this for students and professionals, that intersection, especially early stage, early career professionals. I think that's fantastic. So thank you both for your service to our community.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Nice talking to you, Marino. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both. Have a lovely day.
Take care.
Bye.
So another heavy hitter, like we just keep saying this every week, Joe. We get these practitioners on here. It's been so great to kind of hear how they start their careers, but also the type of work they do. It's something I feel like has really helped us as we get going, and I hope students are finding that value too.
I'm super excited for this episode as well because we haven't had like a main research episode, I feel like, in a while. And Marino did such a great job talking about the research in a real way without like dumbing it down, but still making it easy to understand, if that makes sense.
100%. You and I, like our first episode we did with Jared, like we got to talk to Jared. Granted, I think our episode with Marino should have been as long as the one we did with Jared, so we could have got as much detail. But that I think to get an episode like that where we get to go into the research, I think is always valuable for IO because that's why we're here. You know, we don't get to talk research like that as much, and it's just as important.
Especially about someone who knows so much about the research as him. I like keeping the episode short. It keeps people coming back for more, or we hope.
Yeah, so they can come back and hear him do it again. You know.
Very true. Very true.
Yes. Thank you guys for listening. We will catch you guys next week.